Hi, I'm Terry Schindler with Polyplexus, and I'm so pleased to introduce our two guests for this Talk Polymath episode. Tyler McQuade is formerly of DARPA and now is the Chief Innovation Officer at OnDemand Pharmaceuticals. And Mickey McManus is a Senior Advisor at Boston Consulting Group and a Research Fellow Emeritus at Autodesk. He's also currently ensconced slightly off the grid, so we will not see him on the YouTube stream, but we will hear him. I've had the pleasure of many interesting conversations with both of them, and I promise you a fascinating discussion. Just a quick word before we start about Polyplexus. We're a platform that hosts evidence-based conversations with purpose. We connect a community of researchers, which we call Plexers, with sponsors who are interested in exploring big issues, problem framing, funding, and innovation. It's free to join, and we hope you'll check out the many fascinating conversations on the platform. Now, Mickey and Tyler, please take it away.
Hey, Tyler. Thank you so much, Terry. I'm just a disembodied voice today. This is what we all will be in the future, I think. This should be fun. You know, we met a little earlier this week, Tyler, just to kind of get ready. And maybe we could just start with, who are you, Tyler? Like, give us a little bit of your background.
Oh, I keep trying to figure that out for myself, who I am. I'm a bit of a wandering soul, somewhat like you, Mickey. Mickey's in an Airstream right now, roaming the countryside, doing fun things. I like to roam myself. I started out my academic life, a long time ago now. I fell in love with chemistry early on, and I propelled that interest into an academic career that I thought was going to be, sort of where I'd be for the rest of my life. And I, as much as there's some wonderful features of that, I kind of got bored and started roaming the world a little bit. And at some point, I ended up a colleague of the persons who got involved with starting Polyplexus, but I was at DARPA as a program manager for a number of years. And in my academic life and in my life at DARPA, I began getting very interested in the intersection of molecules and machines, both machines that make molecules and machines that learn how to make molecules. So artificial intelligence and machines and chemistry all put together. And I spent some time pulling that thread to do a number of things. One of the things that I did last was I worked for an organization called Medicines for All, which was designed to develop very low-cost anti-HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis drugs to try to drive the cost of those medicines down so people in the developing world could have greater access to those meds. And more recently, thanks to COVID, some people's lives changed negatively. Mine changed in a very interesting way. I got the opportunity to join OnDemand Pharmaceuticals and to try to do what I was doing for Medicines for All, but try to do it on a little bit larger scale. And really, we're about medicines for everyone, anytime. And so I really, at the heart of it, I spend time thinking about chemistry and machines and how to make those do something interesting, and hopefully try to improve business models and the fluidity associated with how medicines move from the commercial building manufacturing part to actually the patients.
So Tyler, you mentioned OnDemand Pharmaceutical. That's where you're at now, and this passion for molecules and machines. So give us a sense of what the mission of OnDemand Pharmaceutical is and why you wanted to be there. I mean, you were doing Medicine for All. That sounds pretty awesome. Give us a sense of what you think OnDemand can bring to the table and what that has to do with molecules and machines, just so we've got a cartoon in our head about what this is.
Yeah, actually, I think, Mickey, a good way to think about what I'm doing is actually thinking about cartoons. So for those of you who have some gray hair, you might remember the Jetsons, and the Jetsons had a robot that would make their meals. And so, George would ask for pancakes and the machine would produce pancakes. And, that theme, of additive manufacturing in your home to produce things that you need kind of struck me. And that's what we're trying to do at On-Demand Pharmaceuticals. How do you build a machine that can produce, the medicines that are, for you? And that's
so when you were,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was trying to, so I can imagine lots of different machines that would create medicines. But what's your particular focus? Like you've built basically kind of an entire factory in a box. You put raw materials at one end, you get a pill at the other end, and it's pretty impressive and exciting. But is there a particular focus, like because there are a lot of medicines out there? What medicines do you focus on? And in a sense, I love this idea of almost shifting from a supply chain that's got lots of different distributors and parts and pieces and chemicals and stuff like that to sort of I think you said take fire and hellfire and brimstone at one end and have something at the other, and shift to this almost matter net. It's kind of a way to just send the software update, I guess, for the new medicine. But what's your focus? Like what have you done so far? What has On-Demand done so far? And what is it that you got excited about in terms of technical challenges? And that area.
So I would say that the medicines that we're focusing on the beginning are really the medicines of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Those are small molecule medicines, and they are the ones that are sort of the purview of synthetic organic chemistry. That's the discipline that is most focused in that area. And one of the reasons why I like this particular area is if you look at medicines today, the vast majority that are prescribed are of that ilk. Medicines that we've discovered a long time ago and are still outstanding, they're called generic medicines. And so we largely focus on generics because there's a lot of them that are just essential. And, so I like that idea of taking a kind of a technology. Mickey, you had a great way of describing it. You called it withered.
Yeah, withered technology. There's I'll give a little interlude here because I think it's an interesting concept, which is this notion that as technology advances, it builds on the past technology. We don't suddenly stop using a wheel when we learn how to do a boat or whatever. We still have wheels, but they show up in different places and they get really mature through a process that W. Brian Arthur from the Santa Fe Institute calls fractal vascularization. It sort of gets deeper and deeper, just like your lungs, or your blood vessels, to reach every cell. And it also has this sort of structural deepening. It's really bumpy at the beginning, but then over time we get better and better at it. And it gets structural deepening. The first jet engine was probably had to have a lot of stuff wrapped around it that were like classic bits of technology to make the new technology work. Oh, that thing's overheating. We've got to wrap some things we learned how to do. And I was reading about the different sort of the nature of technology last year and really trying to understand how we do this recombinamics of new and old. And when you said, there are like a lot of small molecules that just work. Like we've used them for a long time. They're trustworthy, they're proven, they're off patents, so people can get them we can lower the cost to get them to people. I said, wow, there's actually a video game company that's whole business model is based on withered technologies. And the inventor basically said he wanted to take lateral thinking with withered technology. And so that's kind of a category. And did I tell you what the video game company was? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think you said it was Nintendo.
Yeah, so Nintendo said, whoa, they were not making games. They were making something entirely different. But this inventor comes along and he basically thinks, oh, flat screen LCDs are coming down in cost because we're making them for calculators. Do you remember when calculators were like $200 or $300? And suddenly Toshiba's making them cheaper and cheaper. And he thought, well, wow, I could like use the buttons for the calculator to move back a stretcher, for firemen. And I could have a flaming building on one side that's just a bunch of pixels. And I could have people jumping out of the building, and the stretcher, your job could be to bounce the person to safety over to the ambulance. And he did that, and it became this breakthrough hit for Nintendo. And Nintendo put them on the map. But even up to this day, the Wii and all these games that you see from Nintendo, the Switch today, they're actually technology that's been totally proven. They happen to be using things that 5 years ago were pretty wild, But today you can build things with it. And when you told me about what you're doing, which is sort of like, there's a lot of really good stuff out there. We don't have to get the bleeding edge, but you might have to do bleeding edge for other parts of this, I suspect.
Yeah.
That feels like an important component. So give us a sense of how far you've come, and then what's your big aspiration? Take me into the future. Give me a sense of, it's 20 years from now. What do you hope to be able to do?
Yeah, so let me first just frame out kind of where we're at. So we have licensed technology from MIT, and most of our leadership team has been involved in this technology in one way or another. Like, for example, I was the first academic who was funded by DARPA to prove out the concept that you could make medicines starting from simple precursors and go all the way through to a active ingredient. And then MIT took it one step further and went from the active ingredient to the final dosage form. So we have machines that are essentially little chemistry factories. They do their chemistry thing, then they hand off the crude material to a purification system. And the purification system takes that active ingredient and turns it into something that is pure enough for a human to consume. And then that's then formulated into a final medicine. So we go end to end. And the part that I really love is that the synthetic component and the purification component is reconfigurable. So I can reconfigure it so that it can make many different medicines. So we're up to about 22 meds that we've made inside the system. We formulated fewer than that, largely because we spent a lot of time on that reconfigurable element. So there's a lot of science and technology behind the reconfigurable part, like how do you design the chemistry so that it fits into the machine? That's one sort of tough part, because normally, if you look at a standard pharmaceutical manufacturing activity, it's done in a 4-story building, and you move material from the top story down through each level, and it gets transformed, and you're using gravity to move it. And it tends to be really big. It's not distributed manufacturing, it's centralized manufacturing. And so we've shrunk all that down. We put it in a form factor. We've made it reconfigurable so it can make a lot of different medicines. And we're working, a lot on how to change the chemistry. So it's, if you think about all of pharmaceutical agents writ large, there's about 1,300 different FDA approved bioactive ingredients that can be used in humans. About 800 of them are still sort of actively used. But if you map it out as an organic chemist thinks about it, it actually is like a network or a tree. And it all sort of tracks back down to 3 things: coal, petroleum, or some agricultural feedstock that represents kind of the core of the molecule, and then some minerals, things that come from organizations like Rio Tinto, to sort of add some of the powerhouse, the reagents. Now, we can't go from those materials yet, but we keep working on new ways of thinking about the chemistry, so we get farther and farther back. So someday, it'll be like Back to the Future. You'll stick a banana peel and some other garbage into the, whatever that nuclear reactor thing that they had on the back of the time travel
of the DeLorean. Yeah. So, I mean, the interesting thing would be, you could imagine this already, probably because of science fiction, like Back to the Future, but this notion of, your phone tells you, go find some aluminum foil, go find, an old iPhone in your couch somewhere. Okay, put the iPhone in the grinder and put the, whatever. I mean, you could start to imagine this, and I guess I'm curious today, what is a bleeding edge technology? Sort of a deep technology. I know I've been working quite a lot on sort of trying to understand these technologies that are sort of lowering the friction between atoms, bits, minds, and energy, that sort of create liquidity between these. What's something today that you would love to become withered? In other words, you would love if this bleeding edge technology were like so cheap that they were giving it away when you opened a bank account, because you think you could really make a difference. I'm trying to think of the future of withered technology.
So
for your mission, for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I'll tell you one that really would be lovely, but it's still going to require a number of innovations before it does. And we talked a little bit about this last time. So I understand that you find synthetic biology fascinating, but if you look at the cost of building a synthetic biological system that could make, say, some of the feedstocks, like let's just take, opioids like thebaine, which is a precursor to morphine. While there are academics who have demonstrated that you can build synthetic biology cassettes that can actually make the precursors, it ain't cheap to replicate, and it's certainly not inexpensive to scale. So I would love to see, basic synthetic biology, bioreactor, advanced molecule synthesis, and that kind of milieu becoming withered so that I could borrow it to valorize. Same thing goes with production of monoclonal antibodies. That's still a very, very expensive enterprise. It's not miniaturized, it's challenging, and there's so many challenges associated with that particular field. And then once we get to like some of the more complicated medicines like CAR T therapy, and even the Moderna vaccine, is quite a complicated feat of chemistry and engineering and biology. All those things are they're a little bit out of reach yet if we want to try to stuff them in our box. I mean, I'd love to stuff them in our box, because at the end of the day, I want my box to be like a vending machine. I want it to be a medicine vending machine that responds in the same way that, like the pizza, you have vending machines that can make you a pizza. I'd like to have a vending machine that just makes you whatever medicine you need. And what I'd like it to do is make it for you. And that's kind of the outer reaches of where I want to go, Mickey, is really at the end of the day, when I look at the promise of the omics revolution, genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, the fact that I can understand a lot about you, but I can't really respond in the way that we want to. Now, I know there are lots of technologies that are going after that, whether it's siRNA-based technologies or other more directed, biological toolbox technologies like CRISPR is still out of reach. And at the end of the day, small molecules do have a lot of advantages. Number one, you can stick them in your mouth, right? I mean, you can swallow them, and a lot of them are still active. That's an attractive feature. Biological molecules, so far, we haven't solved that in a commercial way yet. So,
I think it's interesting. Oh, go ahead. Go
ahead, Nick.
Well, I was trying to play this out, and I think, at some point, if we can keep ourselves rolling along, these things will be withered. They will be withered technologies. And then the interesting question is, where is the lateral thinking? How do we use them in novel or unique ways? Not sort of classic ways. The printing press can be used to make an illuminated manuscript, but that's not very interesting. It's really cool when we suddenly can make comic books, and we can make broadsides, and we can, print on the side of a building and things. And then suddenly you see this flourishing of everybody can publish. I'm really interested in kind of how do we understand how to think laterally about this stuff. And you just gave me some examples here, like small molecules. I don't quite know, I'm not a chemist, the difference between a small molecule or a monoclonal antibody or something like that. So, in my head, as maybe a layman, I might think a medicine's a medicine. Of course, he can make everything once he makes one thing. But I think you're trying to draw a really clear distinction that it turns out these are pretty tricky. And the thing that popped into my head was, well, today we do have these small molecules. This thing came from bark, and we figured out how to turn it into something, or whatever.
Aspirin, yeah.
But to get them approved, though, we had to show that this thing was like so benign for every variant of a human genetic organism. It seems to me that when you get down to this n equals 1, make it for me, it could open up the pathways dramatically, because you could like look at my DNA, decide what I will do, have a model of me, try to actually just solve for my problem, and it won't necessarily be the thing for someone else, but it might be perfect for me. And I'm curious about, what's that going to do? What's that going to do for what you can do, but also what's that going to do to the regulatory environment, to the policy world? If you could really do n equals 1 tuning, if you get so good at what you're doing, even in this, let's say the small molecule and the ladder up, what does it mean when it's n equals 1? What does it mean to policy? What does it mean to like what we could do, what we could dream about?
Yeah, I think it changes everything. I think so. Let's just look at sort of how the pharmaceutical industry functions today. So they're going to screen, millions of molecules potentially to find a molecule that provides the biological activity that they seek. Let's say we're trying to treat diabetes, and I don't mean symptom suppressant. I mean, okay, let's try to find a way of regrowing islets of longer.
Regrowing, yeah.
Let's change that whole paradigm. But they're going to have to screen, potentially millions of molecules, millions of potential paradigms of therapies. And then what they're going to do is once they find hits, they'll build libraries of molecules around those hits. And it doesn't have to, I mean, when I say molecules, I mean, Catholically, I mean, it could be a small molecule, it could be a big molecule, it could be assembly of molecules, it could be, a CRISPR, nucleic acid assembly. But the bottom line is then they have to then go through many rounds of then making that hit work for a broad Gaussian distribution of the population so that it's well received for so many people, but not really tailored for any one person.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's got to be average, right? Or something. It's got
to be
like
average.
compromised by superset, I guess they
call
it. Yeah.
So I think what we're going to see is now all of a sudden, we can change the whole conversation. It's not about curing a disease, it's about shaping health. And shaping health requires you to have an ensemble of interventions at the right time based on who you are, not who I am, right? You and I will not have the same interventions as we change, the sort of the metabolic properties of our bodies so that we blunt the rate of aging, for example. I think you had, during our conversation, you said it really cool, something about, the objective is to keep you really high functioning until you fall off a cliff, right?
Yeah. Well, and actually, this is a great, for listeners out there. I recently spoke with somebody named Roger Landry. He was actually the Surgeon General of the Air Force. And Chuck Yeager was one of his patients. He did a lot, he spent a lot of time as a flight surgeon. And then he got interested in old age or older age, let's just say new chapters, as he got older, I think. And he wrote a book called Live Long, Die Short. And I strongly recommend reading this book.
I'm writing that down again, Mickey. I got to make sure I get that.
Yeah, Live Long, Die Short. And it's that notion that as you're getting, we've been told that retirement is what we should aim for, and that's when life starts happening. But a lot of people, that's kind of like you're selling them a bill of goods. They end up having frailty in their bones, their muscles are weaker. Maybe they've sat at a chair at a computer for 30 years. Or whatever, and when they get to retirement, actually they drop off very suddenly, particularly if they lose a loved one, because they're isolated, they're alone, it doesn't actually work. And so he started looking at how you could create these kind of masterpiece living places that were not old folks' homes based on like the poorhouse turn of the last century, but instead were a lot more like mixed generational neighborhoods. And it's all about how do you have a third chapter, fourth chapter, and of course. 8,000 to 10,000 Americans are turning 65 every day right now because of the baby boom generation. So it's a big buying public out there too, from a consumer standpoint. And how do you help them, have like an infirmary like you go to on a college campus instead of the slow decline to death? You're sitting in a bed.
We already failed. If you have an infirmary, we haven't shaped your metabolic properties.
You didn't do it. Yeah.
Well, failed. So. I mean, that's really kind of where that's the part of medicine, the idea of medicine, synthesis near the patient, that we can make the right medicine for that patient. And the deal is, mixtures of medicines are difficult to use for broad populations, because if you make a mixture of medicines, you end up with all kinds of challenges sometimes. I mean, there are mixtures of medicines that are sold, but they're sort of few and far between. So I really love the idea of being able to say, okay, let's measure you let's look at where your look at how good your say DNA repair system is. And if it's not so good, we recommend lifestyle changes, and we give you a regimen of materials that sort of help your DNA repair process go better.
You just made me think of something, and we also have a question from the audience, and I want to get that in there too. First, the biggest, I work in lifelong learning, so in the education world, and I'm very interested in sort of how we actually grow neurons until the day we die, how we wire together new things, chain together long collections of relationships so we can be more agile, wiser, and potentially have upward mobility as the future of work changes. Look for how we fit and learn. And of course, this has good indications as you get older, that learning is a great way. There's a famous nun study that showed that the nuns from 87, when they did the brain biopsies, had all the symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia, but had none of the actually had no physical symptoms that people didn't think they did. They had anything, but when they looked in the brain, it was like, well, there's a ton of plaque. And it turns out that it was because they had to keep gardening, they had to keep teaching new things, they had to teach another language, they had to do things all the way till they were 80, 90, 100 years old. So in lifelong learning, what you find out is the current educational system is fairly broken because it's based on kind of creating, people who can work in the factory, not necessarily cognitively demanding or diverse skills, or if they are cognitively demanding, even if it's like swinging a hammer, they're disrespected. We don't have the GI Bill that said you should go to college after you come back, or as a public service, that's part of your citizenship. And the other thing you notice is that they use something called summative assessment. Basically, you teach to the test. You do a bunch of things, and then you teach to the test, and it's a multiple choice test. And so it's generic, just like what you just said for, it's kind of medium. It's got to be good for people that are behind and people that are ahead, and it sort of meets it's averaging that's happening.
Regression to the mean.
And right when I started working on that, a neuroscientist, Adam Gazzaley, said to me, education and medicine are the same. I said, I don't know what you mean. So they're not closed loop. You can't actually, target it for n equals 1. So you end up with all these weird, malices that emerge, or these unintended consequences. And I'm really curious, how do you close the loop with on-demand pharmaceuticals? Because effectively, I could imagine that if you also had sensing for the patient, or for their, stool sampling once a month, or who knows what, right? Their effluents, you could be literally running a massive clinical trial every day, effectively, in some ways, and this would contribute quite a lot. So I guess I'd like you to answer that, and then let's go to one of the questions or two that have come in from the audience.
Yeah. So, okay. First off, quality of the medicine is an answer I can give first, and it'll actually address the question of the first question on the chat. So number one, as we live in the current paradigm, we're going to have to treat our systems as medicine factories, and we'll go through standard FDA approval processes. Actually, we had a meeting today with the FDA regarding our future submission. So we don't have a FDA approved medicine yet, to answer your question, but we're in the process of getting our GMP facility ready and going through our first regulatory approval. So we're going to have to prove out, first off, the making technology. We're going to have to demonstrate that we can make medicines as everybody else does, and that we are doing it in a way that's improved quality, which is true. I mean, we can measure the amount of active ingredient in every pill we get. We can measure the quality of every small, it's not batch anymore because we're doing most of the work continuously. So we're actually able to measure the entire population.
You're sampling every one of them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to end up with higher quality IV meds, higher quality oral dosage forms. So, the first barrier I think we're going to overcome relatively soon, and that's just demonstrating that the systems can make medicines that humans can consume in the same way that they've been doing it forever. And we're probably going to, spend a lot of time in that sort of, ecosystem, for I'd say the first few years. I think we're like going to be like that for 5 years. And then eventually it's going to settle in and we're now going to have a comfort with the actual preparing the medicines. And so then what'll happen next, year 6, we'll start saying, well, we can make a much greater spectrum of levothyroxine dosages. So right now they're about 15, I think. It's either 12 or 15. This is called Synthroid for those of you who are following at home. It's there are generic versions, but it's to treat people with hyperthyroidism. And right now, what they do is they sell like 1 microgram changes. 1 microgram. I mean, this is really potent medicine. 1 microgram. They go in that kind of intervals. But who's to say that a microgram change is the right change? It might be that, I need a 2 microgram pill change and somebody else needs another one. The bottom line is levothyroxine is an example of a medicine where already the number of dosage forms that are available is inadequate and it's caused a proliferation of them. So I think what we'll do is we'll chip away at those sorts of cases where really careful dosing will give an improved patient outcome. And then we'll do that for a few years. We'll hit other medicines that fit that. There's a whole range of antibiotics that require this sort of very tight dosing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go after the children's med market, because right now the way children's meds are prepared, they take pills and they cut them in the hospital. And then oh well, I hope I got enough of the crumbs away. We don't want little Johnny to end up with Red Man syndrome because he got treated with too much vancomycin. My daughter actually got too much vancomycin once in an emergency room, and you end up with this. You end up with this red flush all over your body.
Oh.
And the bottom line is, so that's another entry point. And then I think what we're going to do is we're just going to keep doing that. And at the end of a 10-year period, we're going to start seeing like, oh, wait a minute, this idea that you can real-time release, you can tailor a medicine that we know about is going to begin to develop comfort. And imagine what's going to happen in 10 years, Mickey. We're going to be able to, DNA sequencing, is minutes. We're going to have metabolomic sequencing in minutes. We're going to start seeing people really hankering for new solutions. And I think we're going to now have a technology that can start to offer it. So the FDA will have to respond, and they tend to. I mean, they're a very lithe organization, even though a lot of times people, put them as a barrier. I mean, for me, FDA is actually a group of heroes. I mean, they have protected Americans.
Yeah, they're trying to keep us safe. I do think, one of the other interesting things that I saw on your site was the notion that you actually have control over the whole supply chain, right? Because you're starting with more precursor materials, and that feels like with the scares that we had of lead paint on toys coming from different countries or other kinds of foods that might not have an FDA, frankly. And one of the things you're trying to do is say, we've got to have a complete supply chain. There's a national interest component to that, but I also just think this goes back to your quality component. So it feels like that's important. But of course, the minute I think, oh wait, quality, that's going to be important. But if more of this is becoming soft, and I've already seen people like war drive past a GM car and take it over and make it turn on the windshield wipers and stuff like that, then that means there's going to be like a bio cyber security challenge. Can you give us a sense of, that whole space? I don't want to get too far into that, but and it does look like somebody asked about what compounds, or is there a way to get the list of the compounds? And I suspect that's probably either proprietary or that's hidden in a lot of research from MIT and other places, but maybe not.
I think, we have a lot of that's public facing. So I'm happy if, I don't know, Terry, how people get in touch with me, but I'm happy to share what I can. At the top of my head right now, I'm not certain what our position on all of them is, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but there are plenty that I can share openly. I'd rather do it by email, so I'm happy to share that.
Yeah. Okay. But so the bio cyber, because this is intersecting, right? And I think there are a lot of discussions in the synbio community about what's the purpose of a newborn child. You don't quite know how it will grow up, but you also know that we learned a lot in cybersecurity that we can carry over. And what's the kind of current posture, I guess, on this for your platform?
Yeah. So one of the things that keeps me up at night is somebody driving off with our kit in a Winnebago. Sorry, they wouldn't be driving in an Airstream, so they'd be in a Winnebago.
Dang.
And
I could totally fit it in here, but the door is a little small, I think.
Yeah. Well, and also I don't think your Airstream is the Breaking Bad kind of sort of vehicle. So
that'll be next season. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Einstein or whatever his name was.
Next season on Polymath. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
right.
We're gonna go right
Heisenberg.
off the rails.
Heisenberg.
Yeah.
His name. Anyway, so we do worry about Heisenberg's diversion for producing drugs that are not legal. So that's certainly a concern. But there are other concerns too, like there are definitely a lot of nerve agents that are easy to produce, and we don't want to make it easier to produce them. So we worry.
Yeah, when you're down to like raw materials, there are a lot of things you can make out of them. It's the recombinamic thing.
Absolutely. So diversion is a concern for us, and we think about that on a number of dimensions. So one dimension we think about it on is physical security, and then the other one we think about it on cybersecurity. And so we're working on smart vessels, so that only smart vessels can load our machines. And then we're thinking about we have a lot of automation, and we have to think about how to prevent the diversion taking place because somebody hacked our machines. So those are just the realities, I think, of any device production nowadays.
Well, and I guess if you're shifting from a supply chain where you can secure like a giant facility to a Matter network, you've got to start really thinking of this as a network profile. And what is the network profile for this? And I do think I remember reading that, when copier machines became incredibly good, they ended up building into the copier machine a counterfeiting alert that basically when the person came to do the maintenance, they would find out that somebody tried Xeroxing a $20 bill and it flagged like where it was, and that's built into all copy machines today.
Right.
And so I suspect we need to think about almost the intrinsically safe aspects of this. There are some other questions in here. I like this one. What is the waste footprint of the machine? So you're taking these raw materials, you're producing something. Are you able to also kind of recycle it? And I think it relates a little bit. There's another question about 3D printing, and I do know that some machines, like say additive. The sintering machines that do certain kinds of additive manufacturing of metals, pretty toxic. You've got to have a really clean room containment system, ventilation system, if you want to do like desktop metal, and then others, if you use a 3D printer, and mostly people just make garbage in 3D printers. I've got like lots of them. And you end up just kind of going, oops, I screwed that up, and you've got a pile of plastic. But I know as a product designer, every time you use the plastic from virgin down, you have to downcycle. You're not really recycling. It's losing some of its strength. What's going on with your machine in terms of that?
Okay, so I'll give you the bad news first. The pharmaceutical industry is a very intensive industry. And so I think the average pharmaceutical material is on the small molecule, which I can define that at some point real quick. But on the small molecule side, about 50 kilos of waste for every kilo of product. But that's sort of the median. Many of them are more, like 200 kilos of waste.
This is in the classic production approach.
And the challenges are, I mean, we're better in some cases. Like we can get it down to, I have a case where we did it 4 kilos of waste per 1 kilo. Okay. Yeah. This is a passion of ours. I mean, I I actually won an award for green chemistry. So, I mean, this is something that is really on my mind.
Okay.
I would love to tell you that we've got that solved, and right now the machine just eats its own waste and produces Patagonia clothing as a side product, but that's not what happens right now. We do.
I see a product. I see like a branded brand opportunity for this right here. We're gonna call it Patagonia. They're pretty green as well. I like where it's going. Well, I do think.
But let me just stipulate a couple
just
things.
Being clear about that is exactly right, because it might be that somebody listening to this is like, whoa, we're researching how to do, something, and frankly, you're open to that, right? I mean, it's just totally. we want to solve this problem. It's it's hard stuff.
So we do. So dealing with waste, we do on more quality by design. So we try to make the syntheses better. So we just generate less waste per reaction.
So you're kind of closing the design, build, test, learn cycle, so that you're trying to refine that in each iteration.
Exactly. I mean, the same thing in the real, like the real world, not the molecular world, but the real world, right? You seek to have less flashing after you make your blown part, or whatever you're doing. You try to make less waste, and that's what we do. But we also recycle materials, and so we're working on making our waste essentially valuable for another activity,
feedstock, or for another thing. Yeah, I think there's an interesting angle of thinking about how do factories become permaculture. I've been reading quite a lot about soil science. And, because it's another kind of, in a sense, deep technology that has been ignored for a very long time. And there's literally a metropolis beneath our feet. It's not just dirt with, nitrogen or something.
Mickey, you don't need to tell me. I actually had an entire DARPA program based on dirt.
Oh my gosh. See, now that sounds like a future episode. We've got dirt and Patagonia. We could do mountains and dirt.
It was called ACDC.
It wasn't
ACDC. Yeah, I'll tell you about it another time.
The things you learn, but that notion that in a permaculture farm, you want the cows trampling the grass, because it actually ends up helping release chemicals that then help the nematodes beneath the surface, and all this stuff. And you rotate crops. You plant those things in between those things, and it's 7 layers deep. And I wish we could see a future where, like, actually your system produces output that is feedstock for someone else's system. And we think about almost rotating crops in our factories. It's not like that factory is going to produce cars for the rest of its life. Actually, no, now it's actually hit a peak. We got to let it lie fallow.
So Mickey, you're very prescient. So look, I can't tell you because it's embargoed, but just stay tuned to a high-profile channel near you, and we'll share some of how we're addressing that concept that you just articulated.
All right. Yeah. Hey, someone else asked the question about sort of, can't they use chemistry-directed manufacturing via 3D printer, heat former? So you sort of just give the code to the 3D printer. And I suspect that I know that there's probably a pretty nuanced answer in this, but because I think when we see medicine, we think all the molecules must be the same if we have nothing to do with medicine. Or when we see education, we're like, how would I tell the difference between the school? They're all closed loop. Are they? I'm curious about what your answer would be to that in terms of, how come you can't just 3D print this stuff?
Yeah. So it depends on your perspective. So on one angle, you can 3D print medicines, but you got to have in your filament, for example, this is just one iteration of additive manufacturing to make medicines, but you got to have in the filament the active ingredient already made, so that your 3D printer starts already the active ingredient is the ingredient. So
it has to have it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's not something we actually have considered 3D printing technology. So remember what I said, we have a synthesizer that can take raw materials and turn them into active ingredients. And so we've thought about diverting that into a filament producer so that we could then do 3D additive manufacturing as the way to yield our dosage from. So that's not off the table. And Pepper, that was a good idea. So if you've got any idea about how we can link up and figure out how to do that one better, there is a company called FabRx that was started in out of Imperial College in London that's doing it. And there's a couple in the US. So it's a very promising area.
Well, and I think the, and I suspect, and it looks like a follow-on question is sort of about, wouldn't that help you reduce waste? I do think, I was talking to Andrew Hessel, who leads the Human Genome Write project, which is sort of the next project after Human Genome Read. Read was the big human genome project. We need to read a human genome, and the idea was so that we could actually be able to help target, medicines better and understand the human body, the quest for knowledge. He's now the co-lead of the Human Write project, which is basically synthesize a whole genome. And there's no such thing as a whole genome foundry today, but you can do pieces and parts of it. And it's sort of just to have a moonshot, like, wait, we could decide to change my kid's genome to grow wings? No, you're going to want to wait till they're 18 and then they're going to choose to grow wings. You don't want to force wings on them, but that is going to be a choice that they'll make the same way they make a choice about TikTok or Instagram, I guess. And one of the things he was saying was, well, we were having a discussion and someone said, well, wait, if you can do synthetic biology and your body is the factory, because how much did flu cost you? Your last flu didn't cost you anything because it was actually manufactured by your body. Like, the virus is a USB stick, it plugs into your cells, it convinces the cells to make some cool things.
Yeah.
So at some point, your system, may get to that point, where it's really helping harness nature even more to do the assembly, because nature is a great factory or manufacturing proof of concept. But he said, I think a lot of people see it and then they go, it sounds amazing, even though CRISPR only hits a few parts of the DNA. So they're actually trying to sequence a lot more things to try to get CRISPR molecules that can reach different places. So it's not like it's a panacea. But he also said, if you want to produce diamonds with synthetic biology, that's possible, maybe, because that's carbon atoms, and carbon is what life's based on. But if you want to create gold, even though those both sound very similar, gold is an element. You need to have gold to make gold, and I think that's kind of almost a corollary to what you're saying here. You got to have the feedstock. You have to have a way, and today you're doing it with pre-formulated, approved, safe, things that have been tested, small molecules, and then the goal is to grow to that larger amount.
Yeah, and I mean that thought is sort of dovetails in with another question. Some drugs must be stored in non-premixed forms, such as lyophilized powders, and again, you're talking about that's the active ingredient, and then you add some saline and you reconstitute it, and then you inject it. And the thing is, we can make the API, and that's the active ingredient, and then we can lyophilize it, and that could be the end state for the system. So, I mean, those are possible, but one of the things, the reason why it's lyophilized is because it's unstable, and it needed to be shipped to you. And so if it doesn't need to be shipped to you anymore, then you won't need it.
So yeah, this is the other, there are all these second order effects that when you get to manufacture in a sort of network approach. I worked recently with a company that was making fresh bread with a 3D printer, basically try to get rid of all the preservatives and sugar and everything else. And if you were to go to a Whole Foods or a fresh food place that has a bakery, you'll find out even their bakery dough has been frozen for about 1.5 years. And there's a very low margin for grocers because of all the suppliers along the way, all the distributors and suppliers, and you got to store it in a bag. It's got to be on a shelf. It's got to be in a warehouse. And what they were saying is actually, if we could create the constituent parts, put water, yeast, some great dough in there, and then the code comes from your favorite bakery chef, and it becomes kind of a network that you could go get, special bread from, some place, and it would get healthier and healthier over time. When they were actually showing these bread things, they showed them at Consumer Electronics Show, people were freaked out and eating a lot of bread that day. And the questions were like, well, how would you do this? How would you do that? How long does it last? And they were like, it's totally different. This is like you have a network of them in a town, and if one's down, the other ones make more, and it's just a network effect. And it ended up giving them 60% margins they could deliver to the greengrocers, which that's a big deal. Like that's a huge deal because grocery stores are frankly struggling,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think there is this second knock effect that you're not focusing on now because you got to get the tech working. But
Well,
you could open up a lot of questions like, wait, do we need to store it for X amount of time? So do we need to lyophilize it? I'm sure I'm pronouncing this wrong, but
lyophilize.
Yeah.
Lyophilize, yeah.
Interesting.
Well, so it's interesting. So just to take that a little bit further, so in one of the anachronistic technologies that I'm constantly fascinated we haven't solved yet are needles. But it turns out that a lot of injection site irritation is actually due to the preservatives in that material that you're injecting, because again, you have to ship it, and even lyophilized powders, you have to put preservatives in them, because you're typically, when you're talking lyophilized powders, it's like epogen or one of the proteins. So for those of you who are you forgot high school chemistry, proteins are assemblies of amino acids in a specific sequence, and that sequence controls, it's like a set of instructions, and it tells the polymer how to fold into a three-dimensional structure. So think of it as like paper and origami, and they're big. And when I say big, a protein would be roughly the size of the Earth, and a small molecule will be roughly the size of an asteroid. So they're pretty disparate in sizes.
Nice. Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because again, I think, in fact, I'm pretty sure Terry really wants us to help people who are not necessarily experts in what you are, but experts in something else, kind of have a metaphor, an analogy that helps us understand this, so that we can actually, help you extend it. And this notion that a protein's the size of Earth, and a small molecule is like an asteroid. That's great. Now I've got like at least a cartoon, although I don't spend a lot of time with asteroids. We've all got cartoons of how meteors it is. We've only got about like maybe 8 minutes left, 7 or 8 minutes left. What's next? Like, what do you want to talk about now?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm super passionate about, and they're kind of a continuum, is, to me, health it should be a human right, and I don't want to get too preachy here. And the reason why I think it should be a human right is because societies that are healthier create more value. And the thing is, what I'd love to see is that if I had a magic wand and I could make this all happen, what I'd love to see is that we've used these devices to democratize medicine access, and that we've changed the business model so that I'm capitalizing somehow, and I don't know how I'm going to do this yet, on your health. I want to be paid because you're healthy. I don't want to be paid because I just rescued you from illness. And so, to me,
it kind of reminds me of the notion of like performance-based logistics or other things, where you basically say, if I can help you stay healthy, here's what the subscription fee would be. If I can get you more healthy, great, and I want to make a profit from it, great. But it's that notion of shifting to a consumption model, which obviously a lot of organizations are doing. We all seem to have a subscription for this or that. You just reminded me of something, which is this notion of, health as a human right. And without getting preachy, I think there's a new organization out called Building H. And the whole point is, how do we build health into products, into our environments, into the way we do it? How does a car manufacturer who says, I'm going to make an autonomous vehicle, tell us how you're actually going to be healthy after sitting for 3 hours in an autonomous vehicle in traffic jam? We have put everything in place to make this torrential river pushing against us to make it harder and harder to be healthy. And and there are amazing examples of what called biophilic design patterns. You basically take a bath in the forest, not really a bath, but the chemicals in the forest are actually good for you, and it's regenerating. how do we reverse the stream? How do we reverse this rapids that's pushing against us, that means that all of our health facilities and everything are about sickness care? They're not about well care, you know, and it feels like that's where you're going with this is how do we reverse the torrent?
So again, if we go back to this small molecule, large molecule thing, so you are a collection of cells, right? So you're an assembly of cells, and those cells are assemblies of a membrane that separates inside and out, and then a set of operators inside that are proteins, and they are large. And they're assemblies like ribosomes and Golgi complex, and your cell is a big factory filled with molecules, and they're big and small. And typically, the big molecules talk to each other, they communicate, cells communicate, and the communication is anywhere from electrons to gases, really small molecules, to larger molecules. And there's this series of communication elements, and those communication elements talking between cells, cells arranged in organs, organs arranged in bodies. The bottom line is all of that is a balance, and it needs to be constantly tuned. And the thing is, sometimes it just gets out of whack. And the thing is, there are evidence that in some cases, if you stop it from going too far out of whack, you can really shape behavior. And I mean, you see things like, Lorenzo's oil. You give this one small oil to somebody, I forgot the disease, but they're suddenly emerged. You give vitamin C to somebody with scurvy, and they're instantly back in business. I mean, that's just a couple of pieces of evidence that say, hey, this idea of metabolic shaping is totally realistic.
Metabolic shaping. I think that's the word for the day. I like this. Yeah.
When I look at the small molecule canon that were really popularized, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these ones that have become the essential medicines in the WHO, World Health Organization, or the FDA's essential list that just came out. Those were molecules that really have become tried and tested, and we know a lot more about what their targets are. And that understanding of the target with our understanding from your friend who's writing the genome is now, to me, like that's a 1-2 punch, and it's no longer punching sickness, it's enabling health. And that to me is
I totally agree with this, and I love this notion of sort of metabolic shaping so that you don't get too far that into that nonlinear space of shockiness or whatever, which probably happens quite a lot. These are complex systems. The thing that I don't know enough about, and I feel like somehow we have to close the loop. How you close the loop to the pharmacist gave this person something. What did their body actually do? What did it do with it? And then how do you actually learn from that all the way at the end? Because I think that's another piece of this. And it feels like that's a missing component, or not a missing component. There's big quantified self space, but it's not. It's pretty blunt. It's a blunt instrument today.
But your Fitbit. So yes, absolutely, I totally agree. Fitbit blunt. But the thing is, I see that the cool part about Fitbit is that it's been adopted. And Fitbit is going to have to drive the conversation forward. Like, what's Fitbit 2.0, 3.0, 4.0? Yeah. So I think there's a whole economic ecosystem about capturing more information about each of us that is going to go untapped unless we figure out how to medicate each of us individually.
Oh, I have a speed question. Because it kind of like this. You're a smaller company, and really this is going to be an ecosystem play. Who do you wish you could work with? Like anybody in the world, any company in the world, any ecosystem like that you could say, I think we would be catalytic for them, or they would be catalytic for me, or, that kind of thing.
Well, I got a couple answers, and some of them are just like wackadoodle.
Gotta do speed answer. You just gotta give it to me.
I'll just say I really like the logistics capabilities of Amazon, frankly. I mean, the bottom line is, if you want to get stuff to everybody everywhere, they do better than anybody. I know it's an obvious answer, but the bottom line is logistics is king.
Well, they've done a good job of building a network. Yeah. Yeah. I think we're
Well,
about up.
Yeah,
with
we're right
time-wise,
at
huh?
time, and I honestly I
Hey,
could
Carrie.
keep. This is so interesting. I just wanted to Mickey, thank you for your time, and Tyler, thank you for your time and sharing all that with us. And Mickey, whether or not, oh,
I
and there
was
he
not
is.
just a fake hat. I was a real person. I was just worried the internet would die.
And I wanted to just ask you if you wanted to add anything else before we thank everyone and throw it out there and wrap it up in some way, Mickey. I didn't know if you had a thought on that.
Yeah, I'd like to. I'd probably want to share. I mean, one of the things I'm really passionate about, what BCG has been working on quite a lot, and I just think it's something for the world, is this thing called the Deep Tech Mission for Good. It's about how do we actually, enlist atoms, bits, minds, energy in ways, in a recombinomic way. And I think a lot of it is going to be different ecosystems. It's this conversation, people that don't normally talk to each other, this sort of inter and anti-disciplinary collaboration is going to be the rule, not the exception, if we're going to solve some of the big challenges for society. And so, I would encourage people listening to check out. We've just released 2 new reports on this: Nature Co-Design, which goes right into how do we actually learn from nature, and the Deep Wave, which we think that there's an epochal shift in terms of what's coming, and we're probably going to need it because of some of the challenges ahead. So that's my little 2 cents as a little bit of a plug, but I actually think it's just good for society, and we need to convince the incumbents, the people who built the last industrial age, that they actually can play in the next one, but they're gonna have to probably tear down some of those big factories that Tyler is showing us might be able to be put into a box.
Well, thank you both. And we will, on Polyplexus, we will be posting those articles that Mickey just referenced. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@polyplexus.com. And check us out at polyplexus.com. We'd love to have you join the conversation that happens on the platform there. Mickey, Tyler, thank you so much. We really appreciate this.
Terry, it was great. Mickey, you were a gas, man. Thank you so much.
Always fun. Good luck.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.